Hello guys, in today's show we have a special guest, Luke Andrews, who has built a really cool real estate company in Kentucky, but he is one of those people who has basically proven many people wrong. He was working in corporate in Colorado and came to Kentucky and got into real estate. And then he was faced with the opportunity to buy 13 units all at once and had no idea. And he wrote a book about small steps and sizable gains, and everybody was laughing at him about wanting to write a book. And so today's show is really about inspiration and how to overcome obstacles and how you as a regular person like everybody next door can do the same thing if you're motivated. So Luke is going to help us understand how we can actually do things that other people say would never really be successful for us. All right, welcome to another episode of the Ideal Investor Show. Today we have a special guest. We are together with Luke Andrews from Kentucky, and he is going to help us a little bit to learn how we can take small steps and make sizable gains in our journey with real estate investing. So, Luke, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate being here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for making the time. And we were just chatting before we started that you're now the second person this month from Kentucky. So Kentucky seems to be a good place for real estate investing. So can you tell our audience a little bit, how did you get into real estate investing and where are you right now? What are you doing right now?
Sure. So for me, real estate investing was in the very beginning, I started very small, like a lot of people do. My wife and I, we built our first house shortly before the market crash of 2008, 2009.
Yeah, you have to give the years now since we have a recent one.
And during that time, as home prices were falling, it was a good time for us to upgrade for less expensive than we'd normally have to. And we were fortunate enough, we were able to keep that first house and kept it as a rental.
Yeah, awesome.
And kept that for several years. That was actually in Colorado. And we moved to Kentucky, kept it as a rental, maintained it for a number of years, and started kind of getting that bug, getting that itch of wanting to invest. And I found some like-minded individuals who wanted to do the same. And our plan was to just, at the time there was an up and coming neighborhood here in Kentucky that, you could get a little fixer upper for about $20,000. We were going to pay cash, do the work ourselves, and then just kind of start from there, start very slow and small. And a package of 13 properties fell into our lap. And so we had to make a decision of, is this something we want to do? How are we able to do this? And can we afford to do it? And we figured out a way. And so starting from going from 1 to all of a sudden 13. And then, we bought 1 or 2 more. And then all of a sudden another package of 15 fell into our lap. And so all of a sudden our portfolio doubled. And since then we have bought, we have sold, traded up, traded around. But I set a goal a while back when I thought it might be possible of purchasing 40 investment properties by the time I turned 40, and just closed on our 40th about a month ago, and I turned 40 in September. So it just kind of squeaking in under the wire.
Okay, cool. Well, I'm sure there's something to be said about reaching your goals, right? Real quick, before we go there, you said fell into your lap. Were those properties that needed upgrading, or was that like a package of properties that was already good to go, rented, making money?
They were properties that were rented. They were not super profitable. They were kind of breaking even on a month-to-month basis, but we saw some opportunities to make some very minor upgrades because most of them were multifamily buildings. Let's see, I believe there was a 5, a 4, and then a 4.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah. When you had those and you said, you were kind of thinking, how can we make this happen? I mean, especially because the 5 is kind of just outside of the typical residential financing. How did you guys make it happen?
Well, we found someone that we knew that had been successful in the investing side. And we said, hey, let us take you out for a drink and try to teach us everything you know in a short amount of time. And we actually ended up partnering with that individual and, one of his partners to get the financing and everything up and off the ground, because it wasn't something we had been planning for. And so we didn't have ready access to the cash at the moment to be able to make that investment right away. And so bringing in these extra partners, not only were they financial partners, but they also showed us the ropes and showed us how to negotiate with trades, how to negotiate with lenders. It worked out really, really well for us. And my specific business partner and I, we really wanted to learn. We really wanted to get our hands dirty. So we made a deal and said, hey, what if we bring a little less to the table for closing in terms of cash, but we agree to manage the property for a year at no cost? So we didn't have to pay a property manager. We did all that. So not only did that help us on the front side, not having to bring the money to the table, but it also really helped us learn the ropes and learn how things worked and how to work profitably by getting in and getting our hands dirty as property managers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure you got to know the properties as well, because when something goes wrong and you had to go there and actually take a look or see what kind of repairs. And I mean, I don't know if you guys are pretty handy or not, or if you need to build
I'm not.
But the other thing that I'm sure people would be interested when they listen to us is when you said this first time 13 and then another time 15 falling into your lap, and we have to discuss a little bit how that falling happens, but were you able to finance them as a package, or did you have to get financing for each individual property or individual house?
We financed them as a package.
Okay. And so how did you do that? Because I'm sure a lot of people say, well, every time I want to invest in something, especially when we go back to the small steps, and I'm trying to get some lending for more than just the immediate property, for which is the title and what the focus for the lender and underwriter and everything is on. How did you handle that? How did you manage to get that agreed to or approved?
So we went to small local banks.
Okay.
Did a lot with credit unions because they tend to lend a lot of their own money. They hold a lot of their own portfolio products. And really we built relationships and negotiated with them. We helped them see, especially since they were larger packages, they were really evaluating them on a property basis rather than a borrower basis. And so that helped us out tremendously. And like I said, we brought in this other partner who was very seasoned and had some good relationships, who introduced us to some other people like lenders that we were able to at least just get it financed. The rates weren't fantastic, but they were enough to where it made sense and we were able to make money in the long run.
Yeah, and I think this is a really good point. We are obviously on our side for our mentoring client and people who come to us being in a similar space, oftentimes look for what are creative ways. And a lot of people seem to be thinking, well, there is basically the only way is like the traditional FHA. I go to like a huge bank or a huge lender or stuff like that. And that is not really necessarily true, especially in what has happened here in 2022 with the rates and stuff like that. I think if we want to help people, and I know you help people with your book and with your mentoring, we need to basically look at what are other things we can do. Like, for example, right now for our clients, we're looking at interest-only loans to overcome this massive increase in interest rates, which also then leads to a massive increase in monthly cost, subsequently reducing cash flow. But I'm personally pretty convinced that the Fed is not able to sustain this very long, not because they couldn't keep interest rates high, but because the government has $30 trillion in debt. And if they have to pay 10 times more than the 0 point something that they used to pay in the last 5 years or something like that, sooner or later, all our taxes are just going to go to pay interest on debt. And it doesn't look to me that the debt is going to go down at any point in any significant way, right? So can't have an economy, in my view, where we basically have 130% of GDP in debt and interest payments at, I don't know, Fed right now is saying 3.25% to 3.5%, which would be 8 to 10 times more than what has been paid last year, which was, just for people who are wondering how much money is that actually, it's about $600 billion just interest last year. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. I mean, imagine you have to pay like 2 trillion or something like that.
It just doesn't seem sustainable, does it?
Well, no, and the numbers get so completely out of there. So, I think we will get back to times where adjustable rate mortgages will become available and interest-only loans. But you don't get that from the traditional lenders. And I'm sure that was your situation with the credit unions as well. Now, when we go back to how you said these two packages fell into your lap. When you came from Colorado, did you always want to do real estate, or did you have another occupation that you then ultimately decided not to pursue anymore? Or how did that happen?
So I was in the corporate world. I had a corporate 9 to 5. I was in strategic marketing and data analytics. And the original, my business partner still today was someone that I met when I was in the corporate world. Mm-hmm. And we worked together. He was a project manager that worked with me. And, we realized that we had very similar goals and we had a similar vision, but we had opposite strengths. And so where I was weak, he was strong, and vice versa. And so it kind of creates this magical partnership, right? I always tell people when they say, well, should I take on a partner or what should I look for in a partner? I say, you want to look for your mirror. You don't want to look for your twin, because it's not going to help anybody else out if, you all are exactly the same. You just want to look for your mirror. The vision, the goals, everything are the same, but you want it to be the opposite in terms of your day-to-day roles.
I say something similar, just a different symbol. I always say, imagine or take an image, the yin and yang in the Chinese astrology, right? And if you're the white part, you want the black part. And if you're the black part, you want the white part, and kind of make a whole holistic unit when you come together and work on stuff together. I wouldn't say opposite, it's more like complementary in a sense. Yes. Right? So very cool. So then I guess it must have been something for you and your wife to decide, okay, well, if we fully manage these two in our lab falling packages, did you have time to keep doing a normal job, or did you ultimately hang it up?
I tried it. I did it for about a year. Mm-hmm. And it was extremely challenging and trying, and 2 young kids at home and a wife and everything else. And, still maintaining my corporate 9 to 5. Now, my wife was a real estate agent.
Oh, okay.
And then so we decided that I would get my license so that I could be a part-time agent. I could help support her in some of that, but it would also help our investment business. And I just got to a point, the real estate team that I was on was in a very much a growth mode, trying to grow their team. And that's part of what I did in the corporate world, was to help recruit and grow teams. And so it made sense for me to leave that 9 to 5 to come over full-time into real estate. So now, in addition to the real estate investments, I also do real estate sales, but I manage a real estate team of over 20 agents.
Oh, okay. Very cool. Very cool. Now, I want to come back real quick to this falling into your guys' lab kind of thing. Was that really just as coincidental as you're describing it? Or, well, I think, on the one hand, that's kind of interesting, but then also maybe you can draw from this happening twice to you to a little bit describing what would be the motivation of the people who are throwing it in your labs.
So they were 2 very different circumstances, and definitely wouldn't have had one without the other. But the first one, truly did just fall into our lap. Mm. So I mentioned I had a business partner. He was at dinner with his girlfriend and her parents, and they had brought some friends along. And their friends came along because they were in the process. They were retiring and wanting to move out of state. Mm-hmm. And so they naturally asked, well, what do you do? And he said, well, I work in this corporate job. My passion is real estate. My business partner and I are just trying to get started. And they said, well, interestingly enough, we're retiring and we want to sell our rental portfolio. We want to sell it all because we just want to retire, be out of the business, and move out of state. Would you be interested in purchasing it? And it was just a matter of him just talking about, here's what I'm interested in, here's what I'm passionate about. They saw that passion. They had the opportunity and said, well, let's see if we can't make this work. And so it truly did. Just a throwaway conversation created this massive business.
Yeah, which is really cool. And I think one of the things that we can learn from that for the audience and, as far as how these things can evolve is not so much this particular circumstance, but the difference between looking for a deal where most of the places you can look that are credible, especially when the times are a little more challenging, are either platforms or MLS or working with agents and stuff like that. But in my experience, at least, most of the time, there is a certain level of urgency on the seller side. And what is really beautiful in your story, at least for that first one, is that I'm assuming, yes, they probably didn't want to wait for years, but they were also not on your neck to say, okay, if you can't bring it together in 2 weeks, we move on to the next buyer, right? And that is sometimes an important component. How can you find, whether it's a single deal or whether it's a package like this, a circumstance where you have a little bit of the opportunity, not, I wouldn't say as much as going to learn, but maybe find somebody who has experience who can help you to work through the steps, especially when you're relatively early, but not under the pressure of if we don't get it together or our lock is expiring for the financing or stuff like that. How important do you think that was for you guys to really make this work?
It was extremely important because, like you said, they weren't going to give us 2 years, but they also didn't say, hey, you've got 2 weeks to figure this out, or, we're passing and moving on to somebody else.
Yeah.
They gave us a couple of months. They gave us about 60 days to kind of get everything figured out. We ended up taking, I believe, about 75. But once we were to that point, they pretty well knew, financing was going through, everything was done. We were just crossing T's and dotting I's, and everything was going to make it to the closing table. So they were willing to wait for us.
Yeah. And that's actually an important point that maybe we can dig in a little more, Luke, is in this process, right? You said it took us about 75 days. At what point did you guys feel, okay, they realize that we are serious and stop even considering to look for somebody else rather than trying to work along and see how things are progressing towards this goal?
I think once they saw that we ordered and paid for appraisals and that the appraisals were complete, they realized that this wasn't just something that we were just wishing and hoping for, right? That it was something that we were actually moving towards. We were writing checks. We had some skin in the game at that point because, appraisals on 13 units, they're not an inexpensive thing to do.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. You're probably, we're looking about 6,000 or something like that in that ballpark.
Probably somewhere in that ballpark. And so I think they realized, they were like, hey, this really is going to happen. And the lender's telling us that everything's moving along in a good direction. And we were very open and honest and said, hey, if you want to have a conversation with the lender to find out how creditworthy we actually are, what is the true likelihood that this gets done? So it was us just kind of putting our cards out on the table. We realized
Absolutely.
We were small fish. We didn't have a lot of leverage. We had some, but there really wasn't much leverage that we had to offer. But we knew that this play made sense in the long run, that it may be a lower ROI than we'd like, in the first 6 months, but 2-3 years down the road with appreciation, improvements that we could make and everything else, that this could really be a home run.
Yeah, exactly. And the reason I wanted to dig into this a slight little bit more is there is, I believe, oftentimes this misconception that people who have a sizable asset, whether it's a pretty significant size portfolio, like in your case, but even if it's just a single property or duplex or so forth, that they have this mass of people, like as we have heard in the media, where you put your house up for sale and your agent has like people lining up around the corner to look at it. But when you look at more from the investment perspective, in my experience, and especially now that circumstances has changed quite a bit, that is not necessarily typically the case. And the more important thing is to demonstrate to those who want to sell that you're really excited, serious, and motivated to make it happen. And as soon as that clicks, as soon as that is there and you keep communicating, in my experience, it's more and more all the other theoretical buyers kind of falling by the wayside because you're building a relationship and a connection to those who are actually serious. Now, with that being said, I want to touch on 2 more things. In your book, the title, Small Steps, Sizable Gains, what would you say is the main part that you would want readers to learn from that?
Well, from Small Steps, Sizable Gains, that was something that I wrote several years ago, just when I was in a time in my life when I was trying to make some changes in my life. I was trying to, make some health changes. I was also trying to make some career changes and some financial changes. And I'm listening to all these pundits and all these, people with books and YouTube shows and everything else. And they'll tell you, Grant Cardone, for instance, who's great and definitely has his place, but he tells you, hey, just go quit your job and go move to a city with somebody who you want to emulate and just tell them that you'll work for them for free for a year so that you can learn everything. And then your business takes off and you're successful and everything's great. Well, that's fantastic for somebody who's young and single and doesn't really have a lot of responsibilities. What about somebody who's, in their early 30s and needs, has 2 kids and a spouse, and the mortgage company doesn't accept hugs and good feelings. They actually want cold hard cash. There has to be something that's in the middle and in between, something that I can do on a daily basis, small incremental changes I can make that add up to these exponential gains. And so that's what I did, is I kind of documented my journey, and I told a few people about it who noticed that I was making some changes, and they said, well, that's fantastic. That could be really helpful. And I got this idea for a book. And so I told 1 or 2 people that I said, hey, I think I'm going to write a book about this. And I got a lot of laughs in my face, and you barely passed English class in high school. And, what do you know about writing a book or publishing a book? How are you going to sell it? How are you going to do this? And that was just really that fire, that motivation that I needed to say, okay, well, I'm going to find a way to make this work. And so I went through, I wrote it. It was very, very simple. I kind of wrote it more just for me, with no real intentions of where it was going to go. And now that I look back on it, it's like, man, I can't believe I ever put that out. I mean, just to get to like the 40, 50 pages that I needed to actually make a printed book, like the margins are enormous and the print is huge. And I even have a disclaimer in the beginning that says that, if you're looking for proper grammar and sentence structure and all that, you're in the wrong place. I write like I talk. And so it's very clean and simple. So that's really what that book was all about. I was fortunate enough when I got it published that it ended up on an Amazon bestseller list that year. So that was a cool little thing that I had. And then that just kind of got me the bug and the itch to go out and write more. And so I created my own journal at one point and have it printed and for sale. And then recently wrote a book all about the investment mistakes that I made early on in my real estate investment career, that I decided, you know what, I'm not even going to sell that one. That one's just completely free. I give it away to anybody that wants it.
Yeah, and it's actually, I just, sorry for interrupting, but in preparation, I went to your website, and I can actually attest for anybody who's listening or watching us, you can just go there and literally go to the website and download it if you want. So I think that's very generous of you and really a great thing. I think people sometimes that laugh at you when you say, I want to write a book or start a blog or whatever, is because they have been told how things are supposed to be or how hard things are supposed to be. But they oftentimes, I would say almost always, don't speak from personal experience. And so I want to always encourage people to take any of those comments with a grain of salt, right? If an experienced author says, okay, do you need some help? Or here are some things that I learned when I started my journey, that's one thing. But just being laughed at or basically being looked at in a weird way, it's oftentimes an indication that most of those people probably never even tried themselves, right? So I want our audience to be aware of this. Now, bringing, your twice falling, having nice little packages falling into your lap, and now you're having, all kinds of courses on your website and books to download and so forth. I want to bring us into kind of like 2022. And on the one hand, I'm kind of with a smile when I'm talking to people, when I'm a guest or when I'm talking to people in the industry, to say, well, it feels kind of good. Not that I feel responsible in any way about it, but it feels kind of good that we're the last asset class standing, so to speak, because everything else has kind of pretty much gone into the dumpster. But I'm really curious. I'm sure you're getting similar questions when people say, well, have we seen the peak? Are real estate prices going to collapse? Am I still going to be able to make any kind of reasonable deals, making ROI? Can value asset portfolio still basically be my path to retirement? And I'm just throwing them all at you because those are a lot of the questions I've heard in the last 6 months, 8 months, something like that. So I'm curious, what does Luke Andros say from your perspective, how you see our current situation and how it's probably going to evolve going forward in the near term?
Sure. I'll try to answer as many of those as I can, as succinctly as I can, but it's from the overall real estate market, I do see it softening a little bit, but I think that it could stand to soften. I mean, we were just at this hockey stick growth for so long that we couldn't necessarily sustain that. But do I see a crash? I don't think that we have the external factors like we had in 2008, 2009. I mean, to me, the only thing that truly affects price is supply and demand.
Right.
And there are some factors that will put some pressure on both supply and demand, but for the most part, it is supply and it's demand. And, in 2008, 2009, when all of those bad loans adjusted and people could no longer make the payments, it flooded the market with supply. And then banks all of a sudden tightened up their regulations, which put less people able to actually make the purchase. So then that slowed demand. So you would just have this massive force coming in on both sides that, causes this big crash. We don't necessarily have that now. We just have prices that just rose too quickly. We still have demand. We still have buyers that need to buy. We still have sellers that need to sell. And now I'm seeing a big influx of institutional money coming in and buying up properties. And they're buying up things that they didn't buy in the past. It used to be they just bought large apartment complexes, and then
Right.
it was 8 and 12 plexes, and then it was 4 plexes. And now I'm seeing them buy just individual single families. And so if it's good enough for Wall Street, it's probably good enough for all of us that are out there. So that's kind of my take on whether or not we've hit the peak. I think it'll still continue to rise, but just not as quickly.
And let me just comment on that. I mean, I am actually saying Wall Street is looking for alternatives that hold their value.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And what they have seen is, if you look at what are the ingredients that make real estate work from a macro perspective, it's the fact that you have an asset that has a long lifespan, that people need shelter, that we have not built. When you go to the supply side, I would say anywhere between 6 and 10 million units in the last 10 years since the financial crisis that are just missing in the marketplace.
I'd agree.
And that because of that, if people can afford to buy, then they have to rent, which makes that side work. And if they maybe after the next few years finally get back to the ability to buy, well, then they will buy in a market that still has too little inventory. So I think in that sense, it's a much longer game. I always say it's a marathon, not a sprint, but I think a lot of people realizing with this aging society that we have, that you have to look a longer term. You can't just hope that the stock market is always going to go up. And I think they also realize after 10 or 11 years of gains in stocks at some point that it's just exhausted, right? So to the other things, what do you think where we're going in the maybe next 18, 24 months?
I think 18 to 24 months, again, I think it's softening a little bit, which really opens the door for investors to come in. Investors, it's been really challenging for them to get in the last couple of years because prices are just going absolutely through the roof. So I think this opens the door for investors to be able to come in, to be able to find deals. And there have been deals out there all along, and especially in the last 6 months, because you see sellers who looked at the prior 6 months and said, okay, well, the market is just at all-time highs. I'm just going to put a crazy number on my house and see if I can get it. Well, we were getting some crazy numbers, but we just weren't getting astronomical numbers. And so if a house was just priced way out of bounds, it's still continuing to sit, which is allowing sellers to get a little bit desperate. And in this market, buyers were looking at it, and I can say this because I worked with a lot of buyers as a real estate agent. My team works with a lot of buyers. It's sad to say, but if a house had sat on the market for 7 days over the last 2 years, buyers start to say, well, what's wrong with it? Why is it still on the market after 7 days?
Right, yeah.
It's always price, right? I mean, price is one of those things that cures everything. And so the longer it sits, the more that it is written off by actual residential buyers, people looking for their own homes, which allows investors to come in and be able to scoop up some deals that they wouldn't have gotten before.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. And I think this is also, if we zoom out a little bit to the bigger picture, it's a wonderful learning point when you look at how are we being influenced when we're not necessarily the expert in something. Right. I've heard so many, and I think they resonate at least with me when people say, well, there is probably at least one generation, maybe even two, that never really experienced significant inflation. There's at least one generation who has not really seen that the stock market could go into a slump or for a prolonged period of time is trending downwards rather than upwards. And I think you could make the argument, maybe not a whole generation, but at least a lot of people who got out of college, got into their job anywhere between 25 and now approaching 35, 40, who've only seen real estate going up in price and in value and so forth. And have basically been indoctrinated. If there are not 3 people lined up in front of the door to do the viewing, then something is wrong with the property, right? So this kind of like, we're kind of in a sense have been conditioned, a lot of people at least, unless they're expert in a particular field, to kind of drink the Kool-Aid, right? They just keep listening to this repeating message and assuming it must be right if I hear it 150 times, regardless whether it really makes any sense or not. So I think that's an important lesson to always ask ourselves, am I really coming to this conclusion? Like you just said, this house has been sitting there for a month or 2 or even several weeks. Is it reasonable to say that there should be something wrong? Or am I just coming to this conclusion because kind of external sources have inundated me with this message that there must be something wrong because everybody is, fighting to get into the door and fighting to buy a house, which was maybe true last year and the years before, but not anymore. So great. I really appreciate that you give us that perspective because, I hope at least people realize that changes are basically the norm, right? Stuff is changing. When you change from Colorado to Kentucky, you change from being a corporate person to a real estate expert to becoming probably a broker by now, to investing and all those kind of things. And we all, if we're really honest with each other, constantly experiencing change. And I think that's something that we just have to accept rather than fight it. With that being said, coming to the end of our show for today, I always ask the same 2 questions to everybody. So I want to ask you, Luke, if you could meet anybody, past or present, who would it be or why?
Ooh, if I could meet anybody, past or present, that's just such an interesting question. I think I would say Steve Jobs. He had such a knack in a different perspective, whereas everybody else was looking for the market to tell them what they wanted. Mm-hmm. He was out there. He was ready to tell the market what they needed. And it was just such an interesting perspective. And there's a lot of negative things about him if you really start kind of reading into his life. But I think he was just his thought process was so different than everybody else's that it probably caused him a lot of frustration and caused others frustration around him. But I think it would be very interesting just to get an opportunity to sit down and speak and just kind of learn, what does that thought process look like? And how can you be that big of a contrarian in your market? Because I think that's a huge thing for us to be successful, is how do we do it a little bit differently than everybody else?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great choice. I would come along if you would let me. But I also have to say, I think if you look at certain people, right, like Steve Jobs at his time, I would say similar to Elon Musk in our time right now and other people before Steve Jobs. And I've looked into that same point that you were just making, right? Like Steve Jobs saying, okay, we need to create something that's the combination of beauty and engineering or beauty and technology. I'm wondering, and I would ask them, are you really bothered by what the external world is trying to tell the public on how you're supposed to be? Because I don't know what Steve Jobs would say, but I've heard, because I'm kind of a little more into the SpaceX and Tesla community and the interviews that he is willing to give, not just to journalists, but to just normal people. And it seems to me that when you're really, really convinced by your vision, what you really want to accomplish, that the bother about what other people say about it is maybe less than you and I and most other people. That's basically my explanation. If I would get that much negativity, like Steve Jobs or in Elon Musk is getting on a daily basis, you must be amazingly convinced that your vision is right, regardless.
It's the very definition of conviction, right?
Exactly.
It's just totally. So unbelievably convicted that they're willing to go against everybody in order to fulfill their dream and their vision.
Yeah. Well, I mean, on the other hand, if you think about it, if somebody believes, okay, I have this vision that this is something we need to do, and I'm going to try to see if it can work, it doesn't really matter what other people say, right? Like, I mean, if somebody were to say, hey, Luke, you got to be a corporate guy, and you say, I have this opportunity and I make it work, or somebody says, hey, Luke, who are you to think you could write a book, and you write a book, right? Like, it might not be inventing the iPhone or going to Mars or stuff like that, but in our small world, we have similar situations where we decide, hey, I don't care what you think, I'm just going to do it, So, sure. And the other question is, if you had a time machine, you could go anywhere you wanted to, including into the future. You know what you know. You can come back, but keep in mind, you can't change the space-time continuum. So where would you go and why?
There was a comedian who did a bit about, going back into the past. And he said he just doesn't know. You and I talked earlier that I'm not very handy. And he said, he was like, I could go back in the past and I don't know that I could convince anybody that I'm actually from the future because I don't know anything. I think it would be very interesting to go into the future just to see how things turn out, to see how the decisions that I'm making today, are they having the positive impacts that I'm hoping that they have? Because my hope is that the impacts that I'm making on the world are going to be far reaching long after I'm gone. And I realize everything is starting small now, but all of these things I've been doing have just taught me to just dream bigger and bigger and bigger. And so I'd really like to see what impacts that I'm having on the world long after I'm gone.
I think that's a wonderful goal and worth going and looking at. I'm also similarly curious. There are some really big issues, that we've been told that they need to be solved in some way, like how we can maybe as a population on this planet find a way to come together. How can we address climate change? Can we really make it to other planets? And those kind of like big picture things. I guess we would have to probably go pretty far into the future, but seeing not necessarily the journey, but the end result would be probably pretty cool. And what came of Luke Andrews' programs and properties and stuff like that, I'm sure that would be cool for you to see. All right, cool. Well, it was wonderful to have you on the show and very insightful. I think you and I are very much thinking along the same lines when it comes to, how do you go about it and how can you actually build a business, even if you didn't know that was something, particularly as far as the industry goes, where you would end up in. Now, if people want to get that book to download or want to get in touch with you, what would you say? Where should they go? What should they do?
They can download the book for free at 10investormistakes.com. And that's the number 10 and then investormistakes.com. They can get that book absolutely free. Or you can just connect with me on my website, lukeandrews.us. It has ways that you can follow me on Instagram, LinkedIn, or just send me an email directly. I'm more than happy to answer any questions that I can. Like I said, my goal, my vision is to change the world through real estate. And then that's what I'm hoping I can do.
Yeah, awesome. That is great. lukeandrews.us, not .com. So if you put that in, and I can attest to it, I did it myself, and you can find all the stuff there. Luke, thank you so much for making the time, giving us some of your wisdom and who you would meet and where you would want to go if you had a time machine. So that was really cool. And I hope we can maybe do it again in the future.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate you having me on. This has been fantastic. Been a blast.
All right. Very cool. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Ideal Investor Show. More info and the links we mentioned during the show are in the show notes, or you can go to our website at idealwealthgrower.com and sign up for the Apple Podcast link. And if you like to talk to me, sign up for a strategy call. Hopefully you want to share what you learned with your network and bring more people in. We are really eager to hear your comments. And until next time, be well, stay safe, and ciao.